Here at the Temple of Heaven, we're reminded that China's culture is thousands of years old, and in the last 20 years it's really been accelerating its entry into the modern world. The question is, what's going to happen in the future? And in fact, on this trip to China, what I've found is that there's been a significant inflation in goods and services, and China is slowly becoming the place where you can't necessarily depend on bargains. So we have lots of companies in the West that are coming here chasing costs and expecting that if you look at the labor costs in China, plus the logistics costs of getting the goods across into Western countries, that China still prevails as a low-cost producer. That's really changing. Inflation, exchange rates, all point to major changes in China. The ability to be the low-cost provider in the world for manufactured goods is rapidly deteriorating. My experience here on this trip has been that the U.S. dollar doesn't go nearly as far. In some areas where there's been considerable amount of regulation, like in taxi fares, why the cost is still very reasonable, and some hotels are still very reasonable. Hotels that you could stay in for $100 US are nice hotels. But if you look at other costs, they're going up. The cost of eating out, the cost of buying tourist souvenirs, the cost of taking tours, the cost of hiring guides. It's all going up very rapidly. And what's also very noticeable is that the Chinese people are enjoying better standard of living. Well, with all this happening, with the problems of Foxconn, I think which is in a way a watershed moment. The problems at Foxconn are symptomatic of the major changes that are occurring in China. What's the future hold? Well, I think what it means for most Western companies is, number one, that chasing costs is not really an appropriate strategy, long-term strategic strategy, because if you chase costs, you then have to move from China to South Vietnam, and from South Vietnam to other places on the globe that are really just developing. And in that process, it gets a bit tiring to go through an infrastructure that really can't support the demands of Western companies. So that's changing. I think what we're entering right now is a China 3.0 stage, and the future growth in China will be highly dependent upon China's ability to move through the phase of the world's less expensive manufacturing environment, and move into a phase where they actually innovate and create brands. Now, what's appropriate is we're looking here at the Temple of Heaven, and the culture is so significantly embedded, entrenched. The culture doesn't change very fast at all. Superficial aspects of culture can change, but the real basic core elements of culture just don't change over generations and centuries. So look beneath the core and you see a very different China. You see an educational system that is trying desperately to improve, but because the nature of the educational system is so bound to culture, that these changes are coming slowly, if at all. And why I mention that is because my travels here talking to business people, teaching in the classroom, I see what the struggles are to engage in the kinds of behavior out of which creativity and innovation emerge. And that's a very challenging, very, very challenging order for for the school system, for the educational system here in China, and for those people working in organizations. The young people can come into an organization where the organization is extremely hierarchical, but the young people who have been educated in more Western ways come in expecting flat organizations, and what happens is they mature through the organization, and if they are to succeed in the organization, they're slowly forced into a hierarchical structure and a hierarchical way of thinking. So we have the challenge of a culture that's embedded in high power distance, a culture that's embedded in avoiding uncertainty through rules and regulations, and in a culture that's had a very, very different educational style. Whereas the culture of the West, where there's high individualism, willingness to take risks, low power distance, there's a very different environment that is more prone to creativity and innovation.